Welcome to our Wednesday night Bible class for this week. Jim Morgan and Aaron Tremblay here, joining you again from the Smyrna Church of Christ. We're going to be starting a new Bible study this week that will be continuing on for the foreseeable future. And we decided and announced last week that we would be doing this class on 2 Timothy. And just want to remind those of you who are watching this version of the class that we will be live as well on Wednesday at 7 o'clock on Facebook. And in case you hear things, we're going to be moving into the auditorium this week to broadcast for the class. So just in case that's something of interest to you, or maybe there are some of you who that'd be more convenient for you to watch that way. Let me again stress as we start this new study that if you have any questions at all as we're going through this study in 2 Timothy, questions about the historical context, which we'll spend a little time on today, questions about some of the verses that we go through, or even just general Bible questions. Try and keep them at least Bible questions. But we'll be happy to
Although if it's interesting.
Yeah, throw it out at us. We'll take time to answer those questions each class when we get back together as we have opportunity. I'll put the link up on the screen for you to be able to send the email to us or reach out to us by email or even by phone for those of you who are members of our congregation. So let's kind of dive into our discussion for this week. 2 Timothy, one of the pastoral epistles, of which there are three: 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. And
which, let us point out from the very beginning here, the order they're written in is likely 1 Timothy, Titus, and 2 Timothy.
Correct.
2 Timothy is going to be the last. 1 Timothy and Titus, as we'll see this evening, are going to be tied together. They're one of a two of a kind. And then 2 Timothy stands by itself. It's unlike anything else that you'll find anywhere in the Bible, which is what we want to emphasize tonight as we're talking about why 2 Timothy.
So we had a lot of discussion concerning where we were going to go with the study, and certainly we could have picked any of these three texts, and they're all really good texts. But we feel that 2 Timothy specifically has some good application and good perspective for us in the time that we're living in right now and the things that we're experiencing. And Paul and the place that he's in his life and the encouragements that he's writing to Timothy about perseverance and faithfulness and being steadfast in his faith no matter the context he's in. I think those are pretty appropriate themes or overtones for us today just as much as they were for Timothy.
Yeah, and especially says, the background of the book is death. Paul is dying or is going to die. And when you get to the end of a life like Paul's, what do you think about? What do you say? How do you send something along to Timothy that even if he doesn't make it to Rome to see you, that he'll have something to remember you by? This is the final words of an old man. He's had a rough life, but he's had a good life. And there's something, I think I used the word melancholy about the book of 2 Timothy. There's a lot of, and to me, I hear this book different than most of the other books because I hear an old man's kind of trembly voice. And he talks about, I remember your grandmother. I remember your mother. They were great. And that's the way I hear this. It's an old man who doesn't have anything else to do in his prison cell, and he is reminiscing. He's reflecting. What does it all mean?
And it changes his tone and his writing, the fact that he has an imminent sense of the end of things, where this is certainly not Paul's first time being a prisoner. This is
he's been in prison a lot.
It's not his first time being persecuted by any stretch of the imagination, according to 2 Corinthians 11. But he now realizes that he has aged even more. He recognizes the severity of the time that he's living in terms of the hostility towards Christians. And I think he really is just sensing he's done what God's called him to do, and this is going to be the end of things.
Yeah, this is where you have that famous phrase, I finished my course.
And so as we're reading through this text, we're kind of going to be hearing that tone, and we'll try to acknowledge some of those transitions or shifts in Paul's writing under his present circumstance. So let's talk about a little bit the time.
Well, let me add one thing to what I just said.
Sure.
It just occurred to me. The book is melancholy, but there is an ironclad faith that lies under the text. Paul may be a little bit, reflective. He's thinking about things. It's not the happiest period in his life, but he never doubts for a minute that what he has done has been worth everything that it's cost him. So melancholy, yes. Defeatist, give up, no. There's an ironclad faith in what he has spent his life dedicated to.
For illustrative purposes, I think Jesus' tone changes when he recognizes that these are going to be his last time, his last meal with his disciples. This is the end of his life is imminent now, and you kind of see the tone of his interactions with them change. It's not that Jesus is losing his faith. I mean, it's not that he's become, he's doubtful or something like that. He recognizes the significance and the importance of that time and the hardship it's going to mean for them. And so he communicates to them differently. That's the time he chooses to wash their feet. That's the time he's trying to emphasize there are going to be some of you who are going to fall away, even though Peter says, never me, never me. But, but there's a shift.
Little did he know.
And so I think it's the same with Paul. I don't think his faith has shifted in the sense of become less, but I think his tone and just what he's emphasizing changes because he recognizes the significance of the circumstance that he's in.
It deepens.
It deepens,
and it's more mature.
And it's very targeted.
Yeah.
Whereas in 1 Timothy, he's kind of writing it, I don't want to say in general, but he's writing to the church and how they should conduct themselves. But now he's more specific to Timothy, the individual, the person of Timothy, and he's writing from the person of Paul.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. We had our grandkids this last weekend, and there comes a point in someone's life when you realize you are probably, closer now to dying than you were to your birth. And there is a shift that comes there. I think that's one reason why, apart from the fact that they're the most wonderful thing ever, I think that's why grandchildren are so special, is because when you have your kids, it seems like you've got a long time out in front of you. And, so you don't appreciate your children as much as you probably should. And I think most parents looking back on raising their children will freely admit that. There's a lot of things I should have done differently. But with your grandchildren, you're much more aware of the fact that every minute you have with them is precious. And that becomes, there's not a shift in perspective, there is a shift in deepness, maturity, and deepening. That Paul, when you look at Philippians, there is a perspective there that is wonderful. But it is nowhere near what it is in 2 Timothy, because in 2 Timothy, reality has set in. In Philippians, and we'll get to this in just a little while, but in Philippians, it's still hypothetical.
Sure.
Everybody talks about, well, I know that one day I'm going to die. If you're 20, you don't mean it. As Travis Tritt once said, you're 10 feet tall and bulletproof.
Yeah.
But there comes a point, after a while, you start looking back. Your children have moved out, you're almost to retirement, maybe you're past retirement, and you realize this is no longer hypothetical, it's going to happen. I remember when my dad was dying, my mom called me one day, and she just broke down on the phone, and she said, your daddy's dying. And that's the first time that it had absolutely hit her. And that is a whole different thing from, well, we know we're all going
Someday
to die.
I'm going to die.
Yeah. But it's not a matter of losing your faith. It's a matter of maturity and deepness. That you realize,
It's the idea that, when water becomes hard to find, you don't stop searching for water, but you dig deeper wells.
You dig a lot.
Right?
And you stay in one place and dig down a lot.
To do that. And I think that's true. I mean, in the presentation in Scripture of suffering in general or dealing with death and those kind of things, it's not, those are the times where we have to go further and deeper. And maybe those are the times where we grow the most in our faith, or we feel compelled the most to help other people grow because we sense the urgency that we have. And so that's certainly the situation I think we see here in 2 Timothy.
That's one reason why we wanted to study this book, because right now, as in no time during my life, death is a constant factor in the background of everyone's life. You see all of these things that people are doing to try to avoid it. Why? Because this can kill you. And that's where we got into 2 Timothy, is the idea that Paul doesn't want to die alone. To me, the saddest verse in the Bible is found in 2 Timothy, over in chapter 4, verse 21, where he says, do your best to get here before winter. Because in the Roman Empire, you didn't travel in the winter. Ships, in Acts, ship tries to go to just down the island, and Paul ends up in this horrible shipwreck where everybody's convinced they're going to die. You just don't travel in the winter. If Timothy doesn't get there before spring, Paul knows he's already going to be gone. And there's something about an old man, and you realize that what he's saying is, I want you here with me. I don't want to die alone. And that's one thing that's been heartbreaking about this whole pandemic. So many people in the emergency room, and when they die, they're there all by themselves. Their loved ones aren't there. You can't have a decent funeral in a lot of situations.
Very true.
People are dying alone. And there's something heartbreaking about that. I was at Walmart. I'm doing most of the talking here.
That's okay.
But I was at Walmart today, and they got this big thing of all of the children that are missing, and I was looking at it. And one of the young ladies on there, it says that she was last seen in 1988.
Wow.
And she would be 53 years old today. And you can't help but look at those children, and it just breaks your heart when you think about what could have happened to them. And they didn't have anybody they loved with them at that time. And that's the kind of thing that makes this book real. It's a man, he's facing death, and he doesn't want to die alone.
And again, to emphasize that or illustrate it elsewhere in the New Testament, Jesus.
Yes.
He does not want to be alone, not only when he dies, but in the moments leading up to his death, when he's in prayer, and he just does not want to be alone. He wants to know that they're awake, they're vigilant, they're with him in that moment. And when they're not, we see his disappointment in that moment of, I'm truly alone because you guys are sleeping while I'm over here praying.
Even before that last Passover where he says, I've earnestly desired to eat this meal with you. And of all things, they start arguing about who's the greatest.
Yeah. And to your point earlier about, we know what it's like to have that sense of someday I'm going to die versus imminent death. We are more aware of that sense now than we were 6 months ago. And that's part of what's causing some of the fear and the panic in the world is everybody, it's not like any grown person doesn't know that someday they're going to die.
Yeah.
But now with this pandemic, death feels closer, much closer. It could be the way that they portray it. It could be with any person you interact with could be the cause of your... And so every interaction now has changed between every person and every place, as a result of having that sense or that awareness of their mortality more so than just... So that's what Paul has. It's just a greater sense of the imminent nature of his mortality. And he doesn't want to waste any time or any opportunity to encourage.
Yeah. You remember the kid they interviewed on the beach, and he says, well, if I get it, I get it. And I remember a commercial they made out of that, and it says, congratulations, you just killed your grandmother when he went back home. It says, okay, maybe you can handle you getting it, but congratulations, you just may have killed your grandmother. Boom.
Yeah. And it's conveying that sense of mortality. It's making us more and more aware of it. And on top of the fact that Paul's in prison, he's older now, all these things. Let's talk a little bit about the context, the time in which he writes this letter, what's going on in Rome, what's going on in Ephesus, and some of that sense, because the time he's writing this in is under the reign of Nero.
At the last, when he's going nuts.
Yeah.
To use a technical term.
That's right. And most of us recall, if we know any emperor as a Christian, the one emperor that we can name is probably Nero.
Yeah.
Because we're so conscious of his hostility and persecution of the Christians. He comes into power about AD 54, and that's AD 54, not 8054. But he comes into power then, and it's almost like right from the beginning of his time in power, each year that goes by, he's kind of getting progressively farther down this track of losing his mind and becoming power hungry. And
because remember that when Paul writes the letter to Rome, and in Romans 13 he's talking about the powers that be are established of God. He's talking about Nero.
That's right.
But he's not yet gone around the bend. Nero has a deteriorating condition, and at the end, his own people assassinate him.
That's right.
Because they just cannot take him anymore.
And we're on the hill up to that climax moment where his people assassinate him, because we're right around AD 64, somewhere in that range. And remember, 1 Timothy and Titus are written about 2 to 4 years prior to this.
For that.
So we're just that much closer to this
Yeah.
time where Nero is going to come, his life's going to come to an end, but not only his climax in terms of the fact that his own people kill him, but also in terms of his climax in his persecution of the church, and his finding them as a useful tool to kind of
Scapegoat.
push some of the aggression off from him and put it
Yeah.
on to the Christians.
He looks for a scapegoat and he finds it.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
so
And towards the end of his life, he wants to just pull everything down with him. That's what the Romans are afraid of. There's a German phrase, Götterdämmerung, which means the final battle of the gods, where just, they pull everything down with them. And I've heard it described, this is what Hitler wanted, this is what Nero wanted. He just wants to pull everything down with him so that after him, there is nothing.
And as we're looking at this text, we're only a few years away from a year that will have 4 different emperors.
Yeah.
And so that tells you that not only Nero's instability as an individual, but Rome's kind of instability. And in the midst of all that, you've got this hostility that Nero establishes before he dies towards Christians. And then all of a sudden, all this changing of power, and nobody knows where they stand. And it's kind of a bizarre time in the history of Rome, and a big shift in terms of their stability.
Yeah.
And so Paul's writing on the heels of this. I mean, if you're only 4 years away from something like that happening, the beginnings of it have already happened. The fracture is already there. You just haven't had to break yet. So, and with Nero specifically, that hostility is already on the increase before the fire actually occurs in Rome.
Yeah. The fire is just the one where everything just trips into high gear. He needs a scapegoat. He goes looking for a group that's small enough to not really have much power, but unpopular enough that everybody knows this is the kind of thing they do, and he finds the Christians. Now to us, wait a minute, that's not, but this is in the early stages of the church. Nobody knows much about us, but what they do know, they don't like.
That's right.
And so Nero uses it.
Some of it is economic problems that Christianity is causing. I mean, there's a loss of business and we're familiar with all this just from looking at Acts.
Ephesus, where the silversmiths are losing,
right. They're losing
money right and left.
The Jewish people are angry and upset because, quite frankly, some of the leaders in that community are losing their power and influence because some of their people are converting to Christianity, and then they won't listen to them.
And they're not coming to the temple.
Right, and so they're losing some of their power. So there's just enough reason for them not to like Christians that when Nero says, hey, this is all their fault, people are willing to say, okay, we'll go along with that because we kind of don't like them anyway.
Yeah, and that's, in some ways, there's some people that are looking for scapegoats today and they're still finding Christianity.
True.
So, that's one thing that we have in common with them. It's a crazy time to be living.
It is. And so Paul, in the midst of that, of all places to be living or to be writing from, in the midst of that kind of pandemonium going on in the world, he's writing from a prison cell.
Yeah.
And Paul's been in prison before, we know that, when he writes Philippians, we can go back to Acts 28 when he's in prison, but it's a different kind of in prison than we're talking about here.
And Nero's not crazy yet.
Right, correct. Paul's essentially under house arrest at that point in time, and has a lot of freedom and ability to be able to do things even though he's in prison.
Yeah, the church brings him, all of everything that he wants. It's, from what we understand, it was actually a pretty comfortable time.
And like you had mentioned earlier in Philippians, he seems to have a real confidence that I'm in prison right now, or I'm under this arrest, but I'm going to get out of it.
Yeah, because, we're all familiar with where he says, for me to live is Christ and for me to die is gain. And he says, given a choice, I think I'd rather die and go be with Christ, but I'm sure I'm going to live and, come back and be in ministry with y'all. And at that point, it's not in 2 Timothy anymore because it's hypothetical. It's still, I could die, but pretty good odds here I'm not going to. And we know he didn't.
That's right.
And if you go back in the book of Acts, you read all of what the judges have said. And and they send the records onto the court. He said, this guy, if he hadn't appealed to Caesar, we'd have let him go. This man has done nothing, even going back to when Luke writes the gospel. Jesus' trial. There's 2 judges, both of whom say this man has done nothing deserving of death.
That's right. Yeah.
And so, it's a whole different story, but it's a more comfortable time.
Yeah, and this imprisonment, from everything I think we can understand and tradition would speak to, where he's being held is not, not a place you want to be held. It's not going to be a comfortable place, and
it's maximum security plus.
Yeah, and minimum comfort plus.
Minimum comfort.
Or
Minus,
however you want to say it. So that's kind of the historical context of the time that Paul writes this letter. But let's talk about Timothy's context then as the one who's receiving the letter. So we've got young Timothy, the preacher. Paul's already written him a letter. This, be sure to tell the church this is how they need to conduct themselves. Deal with some of these false teachers that are among you, Hymenaeus and Alexander, and he's giving Timothy these encouragements. And when we get to 2 Timothy, Timothy's still in that same context of preaching in Ephesus. And what we find out in actuality is he's still dealing with some of the exact same problems. Hymenaeus is actually mentioned in 1 Timothy 1:20. It said him and Alexander, Paul says, I've given them over to Satan because they won't give up on these false teachings that they're holding on to. And then in 2 Timothy 2, he says now it's Hymenaeus and it may be another partner in crime that he has, but they're teaching the resurrection already happened and they're upsetting the church. And so even with everything that Paul's written to Timothy, that doesn't just automatically make the problems go away. Timothy's trying to deal with them, but some of those problems are still in existence. And a lot of us, when we think of Ephesus and the book of Ephesians, the church at Ephesus, we think very positively of it because Ephesians, more so than like Corinthians, is a very positive book for the most part.
We know more about it.
But when we look in Revelation, we see that Ephesus had some problems. When we look here in 1 and 2 Timothy, we see Ephesus, it wasn't the perfect church or by any stretch of the imagination. Timothy's in a hard situation too here. He's going to have to preach his congregation through all those things that we just talked about.
Because Ephesus is very much a Roman colony. Whatever happens in Rome, the reverberations are going to hit in Ephesus. Everywhere else too.
And when Timothy gets this letter, he's 3 years away from preaching through the fire in Rome. He's only 5 or 6 years away from the temple at Jerusalem getting torn down. And we know what happens. It's chaos in that part of the world when that happens. So that's kind of Timothy's context in all this. And we know that Timothy eventually is going to get imprisoned in his ministry as well. According to Hebrews 13, Timothy ends up in prison. He gets released, but he is in prison for some time.
And Timothy's not a real dynamic, outgoing person. Matter of fact, Paul begins, 2 Timothy 1:7, God didn't give us a spirit of timidity. And he encourages him, take that gift you got, fan the flame. So Timothy is not exactly the step forward type leader. Paul needs to write to him to encourage him because exactly what you're pointing out, Ephesus is a tough place to preach.
And the hardship you mentioned earlier on from Acts, where you've got, again, the economic problems that the church is causing. You got this pressure in that community of suppressing Christianity and not wanting it in the midst of that community. Again, in a very real way, we look at 2 Timothy, we look at Ephesus, and we say this isn't that far removed from where we're at, of those stresses and pressures of culture on Christianity. Not so much that they're blaming them for anything at this point, but that they're trying to squeeze them out. They don't want them there, and they see them more of a problem than a blessing as a part of their community. And Timothy going into preaching to all this hardship, Paul's writing this stuff to him saying, here's what you got to hold on to, man, if you're going to get through all this stuff. And so for us, it's like everything we're going through, we got to hear Paul's words, and here's what you got to hold on to.
And there's another factor that you have to figure into it as well. I've seen a theory that 2 Timothy and Titus should be seen together. And 2 Timothy is out here by itself because 1 Timothy and Titus are part of what I've seen referred to as the doctrine war. Because it's bad enough when what you're talking about, the outside is attacking us, but if the church is going through a civil war at the same time, you can imagine if during the American Civil War, Britain had decided to invade us. That would be, that would be horrible. But that's the situation the church is facing. Not only are they being attacked by the outside world, but now we've got this civil war going. They've denied the resurrection. There's people who say, that all of this stuff is going on. And so it's bad enough that Paul, apparently after the jailing in Rome, the first time in Acts 28, had gone to Spain. And he says, I'm going to spend the rest of my life here, but he had to come back because all of the churches were threatened. And that's why 1 Timothy and Titus, they're hard doctrine. Paul says, a passage I think you quoted a little while ago, I hope to see you soon, but if I don't, here's how you ought to behave yourself in the church. These are hard doctrine because that's what's going on. This is a doctrine war. After the war is over, you don't just pick up the pieces and go home. You look at the history of Europe after World War II. I was reading a couple of weeks ago, the rise and fall of the Third Reich, and they talk about after the war there was nothing left. There was just devastation, and to a large extent we're still picking up the pieces from World War II. If there was a doctrine war going on in the church, somebody lost, and most people don't like that.
Yeah, and it's a tough thing for Timothy, being the young man that he is, and Paul understands that, and so he's trying to really bolster the faith of Timothy to be able to endure that struggle. And you're exactly right. I mean, to quote Jesus, "A house divided against itself will not stand."
Yeah.
That's true just in general. Never mind the fact if you're getting attacked from the outside and then you're going to divide at the same time. That's catastrophic.
Yeah. In a lot of ways, this is the most danger that the church was ever in.
Yeah, and on the heels of losing one of their leaders.
Yeah, and they're going to lose two.
Yeah,
because
true.
remember, Paul and Peter are probably both killed in the same year, somewhere between 66, 68.
That's right.
But they're going to lose both of them.
Yeah.
And by the time you come out on the other side, the only one we know survived was John. So yeah, this is a book for a church that is in just total disarray. They're being attacked from the outside, you're being attacked from the inside, and even today people are having a doctrine war about well, this is all God trying to bring. No, this is Satan. No, it is. And so we got this civil war going inside, and then we got the world attacking us from the outside. You're just outdated. You're not any use. You got it coming from both directions.
And furthermore, on that point, you can see why Paul has the need to say, now is not the time for timidity.
Yeah.
This is not the time for timidity, and it's also not the time when you go further into verse 8 of chapter 1 when he says, don't be ashamed. Now is not the time to be ashamed. Look, here's this hostility in the world towards faith, towards Christianity. Here's, you go in Ephesus and they know hey, he's that preacher from that church and he's losing my money and I'm mad at him. Now is not the time to be ashamed of the gospel.
No.
And now is not the time for timidity. In fact, it's just the opposite. And so Paul pushes things a little further with Timothy and says, I've chosen to suffer for the sake of Christ. And I encourage you to be willing to do the same, even if it means to go into chains, even if it means your life, so on and so forth. Yeah. I mean, this is what it's all about.
Yeah, a timid general is only useful when you don't need an army.
Yeah.
In the Civil War, okay, going back to American history again, if you look at the first years of the Civil War, the North almost lost it. And the reason why was because there were no generals that could lead. They had Hooker and they had Burnside, and they had the first one, I can't remember his name. But anyway, the problem was they would look at a battle and all they could see was ways that they could lose it. And timidity. They were timid, so they stepped back, and it wasn't until Grant stepped in. I remember a story about Lincoln. The people who were jealous of Grant came to him and said, "You can't have this man here. He's a drunkard." And Lincoln said, "Find out what whiskey he is. I'm going to send it to the rest of my generals." And there was a very simple thing. They sent him a telegram that said, "This man must go." And he says, "I can't. This man fights."
Yeah.
And that's the situation. In a situation like 1 Timothy and Titus, you got to have a fighting general.
Absolutely.
And that's why Timothy is told you can't be timid. You can imagine if Eisenhower had looked at it and thought, man, there's a lot of people going to get killed here, we'd still be fighting World War II, or maybe it would all be over and we'd all be wearing swastikas.
Sure.
But
and to that point, throughout Scripture, that's the case. There's no room for timidity among the prophets, or even all the kings in the Old Testament. Any of the timid ones who were like, I don't really know if we could do this. Let me call Egypt.
Or judges.
Or judges, yeah.
Well, Moses. Well, I don't want to go back, and I don't know how to speak, and
right.
And God finally just had to kick him.
And that's kind of where we're at here. And again, to stress or emphasize, same is true for us now.
It is.
Now for the church, for us as Christians, now is not the time for timidity or to be ashamed of the gospel. I mean, now is the time, just as much as, I hate to say now more than ever, but now is just as much the time as any other time.
If not now, when?
Right. To be bold with the gospel and to be bold in the things that we seek, because people need to hear them, and the more conscientious people are about their own mortality, the more they're taking into consideration what's going to happen. If I die, then what's going to happen?
Exactly.
And we have the answer.
At a time when people are thinking about their death, that's the time when the gospel has power.
That's right. So Paul's he's trying to give Timothy this encouragement, and I think it's fantastic. He takes the time to write. I think it's a God thing that this letter gets to Timothy, and that Timothy receives this encouragement because of what is about to happen to him. And just as much so, I think it's a God thing that we take time to study it now to encourage us as we sense that we're not only going into, but in the midst of a very challenging time in our culture and our country and all those things.
Yeah. This could be very easily the letter to Jim or the letter to Aaron.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or anybody else. Well, anyway, we're out of time, but I hope that y'all, through this, you've seen why we want to talk about this. I hope you've seen the relevancy of this book. And especially, I hope you'll go back and now just start reading it. It's only 4 chapters. It's a very short book. And if you look at it from the viewpoint that we've talked about this evening, I think you're going to see that there's some really serious things to think about in this little book.
Yes. Have a great week.
Thank you.